So the balanced data slate has actually given some really meaningful buffs to the Imperial Guard. Let's talk about the massive shooting effect of Hammer of the Emperor, and this pile of free gear that we can now put on infantry squads. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd really focus on the Imperial Guard and their fairly exciting buffs that they received in the data slate. I think it's going to be a good excuse to put some guard armies back on the table, and really quite nice to give the struggling guard forces something while they cling on for their codex. We'll talk briefly through the previous data slate buffs, then go through Hammer of the Emperor and some nice math hammer on how it improves the various different units, and then we'll talk about loading up all the infantry squads with a whole ton of free gear, which is really quite fun too. So in the previous edition of the balanced data slate, the guard got a few meaningful changes, things that certainly helped buff the faction a little bit, but I'd argue just didn't really do enough meaningful things to actually make them be worth it compared with other armies in 40k. 9th edition really has had some crazy power creep going on. First up, they gave us that tank order's ability to apply to other vehicles, which I thought was pretty bad to be honest. The tank commander's almost always going to be the best beneficiary of the buffs that they can receive, and even with Pask will struggle to hand out reroll ones to hit quite as well, due to Cadians getting it innately if they're stationary anyway. Maybe not a terrible buff on a Manticore in the early turns of the game, or perhaps zooming a Chimera up super quickly, but generally I thought it was quite niche in application. Similarly, the infantry squad orders within 6 inches is quite a nice quality of life thing, but I don't think it was generally going to be a meaningful power boost. Orders aren't really all that hard to come by, and mass infantry certainly wasn't strong enough to be a damage dealing option in its own right, though things might change now they can get a whole load of gear for free. Finally, that Lehman Russ 2+ armor save change was a lot more interesting. A solid boost to one of the strongest units in the codex, getting a 5+ save against AP-3, and making it even harder for lower AP things to take them out. Just from some napkin math, it now takes around about 7.5 Lascannon hits to down a Ross rather than 6. So against good dedicated anti-tank firepower, that's usually going to be around about a 25% durability boost. Not too bad. All of this though I felt was really quite light touch, not really enough to make Guard good or compete properly with the other 9th edition codexes, so it is pretty cool that in this April data slate, they've given something far stronger in a general increase of firepower across the entire army. The big headline news is this Hammer of the Emperor buff. Ranged attacks auto wound on 6s to hit, and it applies to any regiment keyword units, provided all the models in your army that have the regiment tag are drawn from the same one. You have to do this anyway in the Warzone Nachman missions, so it's not exactly like that's any sort of trade-off, but it does only apply to units with the regiment tag, so not advisors or auxilia. I must admit I'm a little bit unsure whether or not Militarum Tempestus Scions actually get this or not. I think you could probably argue it either way at the moment. They have the Tempestus regiment tag, not the standard regiment one, so they wouldn't get it through that, though there is a section that says that they count the Militarum Tempestus keyword as their regimental keyword. They do this for all purposes, but it still doesn't mean that they actually have the regiment tag. My instinct is that Games Workshop didn't deliberately try and exclude Scions from this, they've just written themselves into some slight complications with the keywords. I feel it perhaps needs an FAQ or the next edition of the data slate to clarify things. Kind of annoying really, as the mass low strength high AP weapons of the Scions will be absolutely amazing with this new rule. I've also seen some people having concerns about things like Gaunt's Ghosts breaking the thing about having the same regiment tag, but that's actually not the case. They never have the regiment tag to start with, they just have a declared regiment, so you can still include them in your force without losing the ability. And I would say the same goes for Scions. I believe you'll still be able to include units of Scions in a list without losing this on all the regiment units. In any case, for the units that we're absolutely 100% sure it does apply to, 6s to hit auto wounding is a powerful but slightly weird buff. It's a bit weird because it massively rewards low strength firepower. It does help high strength things that wound on 3s or 2s, but just not nearly as much. I might have expected Games Workshop to go down the line of 6s generate an extra hit. That could be one of the best ways to add a flat buff to the entire faction if they wanted to. This one does feel slightly slanted in favour of helping out things like Lasguns, which with their low strength auto wounding on 6s is amazing. Guard hitting on 4s means that when you hit you either get a 4, 5 or 6, and that means that 1/3 out of every single one of your hits will be an auto wound now, so it's particularly nice on any efficient source of fire that was only hitting on 4s to begin with. It also means that any source of full rerolls to hit are really very valuable, things like the Cadian full reroll order for infantry or the Vengeance for Cadia stratagem. If you're fully rerolling hits, you're going to wind up with more 6s. Overall, I certainly like it quite a lot. It is a meaningful damage buff that actually reduces the amount of dice that you need to roll. Anything that can be done to make the guard shooting phase a bit more fearsome again is good in my book. Most of them don't really do close combat or psychic to any great extent, so shooting kind of has to be where it's at. So let's take a look at a few examples then and how much the shooting actually improves for real units against real targets. First up, I couldn't resist taking a look at some mass Lasguns. For the example, I think we'll use some veterans with Lasguns, as thanks to the other update that we'll talk about, infantry squads aren't going to be taking just stock Lasguns anymore, they'll be armed with more fancy stuff. In reality, that might mean that you don't really see all that many mass Lasgun squads anymore outside things like conscripts, but it's still interesting to see what they'll do. Just as an example, here's two veteran squads for 65 points each, plus a 25-point platoon commander, 74 shots at ballistic skill 3+, if within 12 inches and we're using first rank fire, second rank fire. Against toughness 5 orc boys, they previously would have killed 13 of them, now they killed 20. Around plus 50% damage there, so an absolutely huge boost from this rule against that kind of horde. Against space marines, those flashlights would have done around about 5.5 wounds to them, now it deals about 8.2. Roughly one extra marine downed, and again around about a 50% damage increase, and hilariously enough it really does make them threaten even toughness 8 3+ save units. Say for example, if they were taking aim at an Imperial Knight within 12 inches, they previously would have done about 3 wounds of chip damage, now they do about 6, that's over double the damage that they would have had previously. And it does feel a bit weird that even your chaff with Lasguns can genuinely focus fire to melt down even the toughest targets. It's still not a particularly efficient source of anti-tank fire, but you basically will be reliably stacking wounds on just about any target that doesn't have a 2+ save. In particular, Lasguns are really going to be a strong threat against any toughness 4 or 5 infantry, particularly ones with fairly mediocre or bad saves, and it really is very strange that they just directly beat regular bolters in a straight shooting contest against targets that are toughness 5 or toughness 8. They're not going to win against everything depending on other buffs, but it's really quite strange having flashlights show up the explosive bolter shells. I do think the new rule seems kind of strange to have them so effective against tanks, but I don't think it's exactly the most overpowered thing in the world. Kind of funny that the meme of the guardsman with the lasgun and faith in the emperor really does have a little bit more chance of vanquishing all foes. If we take a look at a big gun with a Lehman Russ Demolisher, maybe one of the most efficient anti-tank choices in the entire codex, the buff maybe isn't so crazy, but it still is pretty good. Say if our Demolisher tank was taking aim at a toughness 8 3+ save vehicle, it usually averaged 10.5 wounds before, now he averages 12. Against targets that you're wounding on 3s, it's typically going to be something like a 14% damage increase. It's quite nice that it's a bit more meaningful news that we're actually delivering direct buffs to some of the best units in the faction that will actually genuinely make them stronger. With the focus on low strength shots being so key though, the Lehman Russ Punisher might be worth a second look. They're not really fielded too often these days due to the amount of high save targets going around, but I guess they could be a bit more meaningful now they're just a touch more general purpose. A Punisher cannon with 40 shots when firing with grinding advance will be firing out at strength 5 AP 0 damage 1. Previously would kill say 10 Necron warriors before reanimation, now it'll kill 11.6, and it'll do around about 3.5 wounds to a toughness 7 or toughness 8 3+ save vehicle, and now it'll do about 5.2. Again, it's around about a 14% increase against the hordes, or a big 50% bump against the vehicles, though admittedly it wasn't very good against them before. Again, it's going to be very nice against anything with high toughness and a relatively low save. Things like greater demons come to mind. The change will also help out things like heavy bolters, and any of the small low-cost upgrades that you can stick on tanks, things like heavy stubbers or storm bolters. Finally, for our Hammer of the Emperor examples, we've got some Cadian mortars. Say you've got 2 Cadian mortar squads and a platoon commander for 125 points, he can issue the 4 rerolls to hit with Cadian's order to both of them with that new infantry order thing. So now we've got a whole load of indirect firepower, rerolling to hit, and hopefully generating a whole cluster of 6s. It's really quite merciful that Games Workshop chose to exclude the guard from the barrage weapon nerf. To be honest, I don't think that most of the game really needed all that much of a tone down of ignores line of sight weapons. It was mainly Tau that were the problem, and maybe slightly Eldar, but it definitely would have been overkill to slap -1 to hit on all the guard units that only hit on 4s anyway, so kind of a lucky escape that Games Workshop considered the guard in this. In any case, for a Cadian mortar team with 2 squads full of 3 mortars, you previously would have killed around 4 or 5 Necron warriors, or done just under 2 wounds to a toughness 7 vehicle. You're now looking at more like 6 Necron warriors, or 3 wounds to a toughness 7 vehicle, which given the hefty premium on ignores line of sight firepower isn't actually too bad. That's certainly going to annoy enemy objective holding chaff. In terms of damage boost, the new rule gives us an extra third of damage against toughness 4 targets, or an extra 66% against toughness 7. so it is a pretty major increase when you've got 4 rerolls to hit going on, like the Cadians do. It's also going to be really nice with things like Vengeance for Cadia as well. If you're fighting Chaos, they're quite likely to be taking a whole load of auto wounds. That will be pretty epic on a first rank, second rank firing infantry squad, or something like a Lehman Rust Punisher. Overall, it's going to make the guard firepower a fair bit more dangerous, something that they sorely needed. Moving on to the other buff though, infantry squads getting free kit is also really quite exciting, although again a slightly weird and not very intuitive way to buff the faction. Infantry squads are 60 points now, going up 5 from 55, and strangely enough actually does make them a little bit worse if all you wanted was cheap objective secured chaff with move move move. Still though, in reality it's definitely not a nerf, even just the incidental damage output of all those free upgrades will generally outweigh it quite greatly. And it really is quite a peculiar change that the standard guard infantry squad has basically gone from taking nothing but Lasguns almost all the time, to now the optimal loadout being to load up on every single war gear option going. Heavy weapon teams, special weapons, Voxcasters and Sergeant upgrades galore. The cynical part of me makes me think that this might be a minor sales tactic. A lot of people will have mass Lasgun infantry squads, but might not have bothered with so many fancy upgrades. So for the next few months it's going to be great to run plasma guns and las cannons and things, before the codex probably flips it back to normal, and the infantry squads have to pay for their war gear just like everything else in Warhammer 40k. Don't get me wrong though, it is fun to actually see the squad's upgrades being used, and it's kind of a bit more fun than just throwing out mass lasgunners everywhere. This basically translates to take the highest value war gear on the infantry squad all the time. For the heavy weapons team, I think you're going to be hard pressed to turn down the las cannon. I guess you might consider the mortar if you're pretty sure that the squad's going to be hiding out the back out of line of sight. For the special weapon, I'd be typically going for the plasma gun due to the longer range, meaning that you don't necessarily have to move it out of position too much, though if you do know that you're charging down the enemy, the melter gun will be fine too. For the sergeant, you may as well always pick up the power sword, at least it will give them a tiny bit of fight back when the enemy charges them, and then you'd likely want to pair that with a plasma pistol, though if you think that you're going to be holding back and just doing gun lining all the time, the bolter might actually be better as it's going to be shooting more. Finally, and in a move that's quite good fun, it now makes sense just to put Voxcasters in every squad as well. The upgrade that's been kind of garbage for the points cost ever since Games Workshop released the Guard Codex in 8th, and now it does mean that the officers will be able to relay their order that little bit better, going out to 18-inch order range, providing the officer does have a Voxcaster somewhere within range of him. Overall, I think it is going to make Foot Guard a lot more fun. Getting all sorts of fancy upgrades to play with is going to be quite interesting. It does mean that even if they're not the ideal damage dealers, they might just be opportunistically able to gun down a few tanks or something. Though I do feel that actually the ideal situation would be just to price the upgrades in a way that makes them usable but not auto-include. I feel we could probably have Lasgun Guardsmen at 55 points and then just have most of the upgrades being a fair bit cheaper than they are right now, and they would actually see play. It's going to be interesting to see what guard players actually do with this in lists. I'm still a bit skeptical as to whether or not people are actually going to be fielding 100% foot guard. The theoretical damage output is okay, but it is a bit unwieldy and just not quite as punchy as some of our other options like Demolisher Cannons. In early 8th edition, foot guard could kind of get by in terms of damage output, though their main thing was just mass durability with so many bodies. As all the codexes have come out, their durability is still kind of okay, but their damage output just hasn't kept up with how tough everything is in 9th. It means that usually the infantry are just there for screening and jumping on objectives, and the tanks are the ones that actually are doing any damage. Now though, you can get really quite a lot of firepower going for fairly cheap. Say if you were fielding 12 infantry squads in a couple of battalions or a brigade, that will now cost you 720 points, and in theory you've got really quite a lot of damage coming at you at 24 inches. Say if we build all the squads for long range duties, that would be 12 las cannons, 12 plasma guns, 12 bolters and 84 lasguns, and bear in mind that they're all going to be auto wounding on 6s to hit now. Just in theory craft land, if we did get them all to be able to fire at the same target, they do around about 28 wounds to toughness 7 vehicles, or around about 14 standard Space Marines killed, though in hindsight I realise that might be slightly overstated now, due to me not factoring in their new Armour of Contempt. That had hurt the plasma and las cannon output a fair bit, so it might be more like 11. Still though, at least compared with current foot guard chaff, that's really quite a lot of firepower, and should be dealing a fair amount of chip damage to the enemy army. It's definitely not without its downsides though. That many infantry squads are just going to be very unwieldy. I think a lot of the time we'll have things that are just outside 24-inch range. The las cannons don't really want to move, so you might be left with tricky decisions whether you move them or not. And of course you'll be taking casualties fairly quickly, so the models in the most useful positions are probably going to be the ones to die early. However, I still think that as a formation it does look quite intimidating. Orders, rapid fire, and some regiment traits can make it a bit better. It's going to be a fairly scary gun line just to throw enemy elites into. You're going to be able to focus fire quite well if they move within rapid fire range. And to bear in mind that their main function is probably still going to be cheap chaff to grab objectives, allowing for heavy weapon teams who have still got almost 110 Auspex bodies there. Considering you're still going to be backing that up with things like Lehman Russ demolishers and some artillery probably, it's quite nice that the chaff infantry can just occasionally contribute a bit of chip damage, even if it might be hard to bring all that force to bear on any one target. I think at the very least it could be quite good fun to field a very infantry heavy guard force. It's going to be kind of fun to open the vaults and deploy some mass Lasguns on the board once again. So let me know what you think of the changes then, particularly if there's anything that I've missed, and I'll be interested to hear if anyone else has got any other insights on the Scion Six Sister Wound thing. Is it something that just needs an FAQ, or does it work out that they get it rules as written at the moment? I'll post a correction comment if I happen to be fully convinced one way or the other. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I'll certainly cover anything else interesting for the Imperial Guard as it comes out. I look forward to reviewing the Codex in full once we get it. Finally, if you have been enjoying the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, which is how I can afford to keep making all these videos quite so regularly. If you are enjoying a fair bit, any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.